welcome. We're happy to have you. Just a little bit about how the structure of today's talk will go. We're going to have our guest speaker present for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion and Q&A with everyone. So we welcome and encourage you to turn on your mics and ask your questions directly, or you can also submit any questions or comments using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest this week, Dr. Joe Orefice. Dr. Orefice is a lecturer at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He also oversees the management of roughly 11,000 acres of Yale-owned forest land throughout New England. And today, Dr. Orefice is going to talk to us about his expertise in agroforestry, which is, he'll explain much better than I can, but it's the intersection of farming and forest management. And specifically, he's going to be talking to us a little bit more about the role of trees in agriculture and food production. And he's broadcasting from his farm, so it's a very appropriate setting. Joe, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us this morning.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thanks to all the students who and teachers who are able to make this happen and are joining in today. Sorry we can't do it in person, but this is fun. So yeah, I'm going to talk today. I'll give you a quick overview of, I'll give you an overview of sort of the role of trees in agriculture and some of the history there. And then I'll talk about how we can think about this in a modern sense in practices such as agroforestry. For example, the image you see on the screen there is silvopasture, which is integrating trees and pasture. So a little bit about, let me just get about what I do. So I'm broadcasting today from my greenhouse. So in addition to my role as a lecturer at Yale and director of forest and agricultural operations, I have a little farm that I own up in Union, Connecticut. And so just to give you an idea where we're at, we have some fig trees and some greens growing. We have a whole bunch of tomatoes ready to go in the ground. We have some pigs. You can see the pigs doing a little bit of weeding for me. Everyone's going to come say hello. Hey, pig. Yeah. So that's just where I'm at today as a broadcast. But my role with Yale is through our Yale School of Forests, and Yale School of Forests are 10,000 plus acres of land, water, streams in northeastern Connecticut. And we also have forests in New Hampshire and Vermont. And the goal of these forests is as an educational resource and also a place that we manage, and we utilize wood resources and other resources as sources of revenue for keeping those forests healthy. And we also conduct research on how we can sustainably utilize forest resources such as wood and maintain healthy ecosystems. And so some of the things that we do, we have students in the photo on the left working to manage timber. We have students in the photo at the bottom right using wildfire to maintain specific habitat types. So we do a lot of really neat things on the Yale School Forests. What I'd like to get into today is just how trees fit with agriculture and some of the earliest evidence of agriculture, so of humans, so agriculture being humans intentionally mitigating plants or animals to produce more than what would naturally be found. And so, you know, if it's farming crops, we're trying to grow more food for us on that piece of land than what we would find if we were just gathering food in the wild. And that's really what we've done with agriculture and cultivation. And so some of the earliest evidence of humans finding plants on the landscape and selecting them and saying, these are the plants we want to grow more of here where we live, actually comes from trees. And this slide, which I'm not going to go through the whole slide with you on, but we can talk about it more in the future if you'd like. This is a recent paper that showed that those earliest crops humans were bringing in were actually Can you all still hear me okay? Give me a okay, great. I just had a warning on my computer, but I think we're okay. So fig trees are a tree, and they're one of the earliest crops. And what's interesting about that is they trying to change my slide. They were domesticated, or at least selected and farmed based on the evidence we have on the ground before things like wheat. So it's often believed that wheat and other grains were some of the first things that humans farmed. But recent papers show that actually it was about 11,000 years ago when humans started intentionally growing fig trees in orchards. And that happened in the Middle East. And at a similar time, we started to see some grains like rye, and then a few thousand years more recently, we saw things like our ancient wheats, emmer wheats, and then barley, and then from there it moved on. And rice in Asia and millet was also one of the earliest domesticated crops. So it wasn't just that everything happened in one place. What was interesting about agriculture, it was at this time period called the Neolithic Revolution, when humans went from hunter-gatherers across the world to really developing technologies and selecting crops and living in one place and farming, which that living in one place, that community aspect that agriculture allows, because you don't deplete the natural resources around you, you're growing things on site, actually led to a lot of cultural development too. So trees and agriculture, they go a long way back. I'm going to talk a little bit about trees, and figs are a passion of mine. I have fig trees behind me. I'll tell you a little bit about that family history behind those, but figs are really neat, and tree crops have a lot of potential. One of the nice things about tree crops over annual crops, so things like wheat that you have to plant and grow every year, corn, you plant it, and then you have to replant it the next year. Well, trees, if you grow them well, they'll come back every single year. And so what's neat about some of these ancient fig trees is they're actually gynodioecious, and those trees are female trees that produce a crop without being pollinated. So you can take something that needs really warm temperatures, a fig, and you could grow it in a more northern climate like here in Connecticut. And when you have the selected ones, so the rare ones, when you found those and selected those, you can grow those and they'll pollinate. They'll produce fruit without being pollinated. So if anybody's ever had a seedless watermelon, seedless watermelons have the same dynamic. So most tree crops or plant crops, when they produce a fruit, such as a watermelon or a fig, they won't ripen that fruit unless it's pollinated. But what's neat about these individual selections are these are the mutants, essentially, that will ripen their fruit even though they haven't been pollinated. So you can grow them in conditions where you don't have the pollinators. And for seedless watermelon, the other benefit is we don't have seeds in our watermelon. So just figs are a really neat tree crop that I bring up to introduce this, because they go back to the earliest forms of agriculture, and they have this really neat selection process where you find the trees that will produce a fruit in a more cold climate without the pollinator, which is actually a wasp. And so these are some of my fig trees, and same with the ones behind me. These fig trees, they're not pollinated, so the seeds won't germinate. But what's really amazing about them is a cutting. So one twig can create a whole new tree. If you plant it, it'll root, it'll grow. And so these trees behind me and the trees you see in the image there all actually came from my great-great-grandfather in the bottom right-hand corner, who my great-grandfather brought the trees over to Connecticut 100 years ago. And then he brought one twig. And so that same twig has been growing in my family. Now there's multiple trees. I mean, there's a few hundred of those trees between my parents' farm and my farm, all from one twig. So it's just really amazing what trees can do. Here's a science sidetrack. All right. So for those of you teachers out there, if you're looking to give an assignment to your students, this is a free video from PBS. It's on YouTube. It's called The Queen of Trees. It's really, really amazing. It's full of anthropomorphism. So they call the tree, they make it seem like everything's has these human attributes, but it's done in a really nice way to learn about the ecology of how this works. And so what's amazing about figs is it's actually a wasp that climbs inside and pollinates the fig. So if somebody's looking for a great video to watch, it's about an hour long. It's really neat. I actually got connected to this video through a friend of mine when I was a student at Yale 10 years ago who worked on the video. So check that one out. It's free online. So some other trees. So it's not just figs, right? There's a lot of trees that have history in agriculture. So bur oak, this one's native to North America. This is a white oak. It has a really big acorn. Look at the size of the acorn in the top right of that image next to a quarter. Really large acorn. It's a sweet acorn, and acorns are really important for humans, or traditionally were important for humans. We don't eat them all that much in modern times. Not that we couldn't, but we just tend not to for a number of reasons. But bur oak, if you look at the range map, you see the darker areas where bur oak is native. And if you look down here in Alabama, and you look in some of these other parts of the Northeast, parts of northwestern Connecticut, even up into Maine, there's these little pockets of bur oak. And all of those pockets correlate to where Native American settlements were. So where you had Native American farming communities, you also find native natural bur oak. And it's not native or natural. It was introduced by Native Americans in many of those areas to produce those large acorns that they wanted to eat. So bur oak's a really neat example of humans keeping certain trees on the landscape for agricultural purposes. Oak, the genus oak, and there's lots of oak trees in New Haven, and you or I could probably tell you exactly where every one of them is. But oak, as in humans, is really valuable because oaks produced acorns and a number of other uses. You can see all the uses here by indigenous people of the Western United States. But acorns as a staple crop are really important. So this is a document showing how some of those acorns in the southwestern United States were still being harvested by native peoples in the early 1900s. And it still goes on today. There's a number of native communities that still harvest acorns. Some of these communities do it in a more modern process, as you see here. But this is taking acorns, turning them into flour, which then can be used for a variety of food purposes. And how are those trees managed? You know, these weren't just people going out and collecting random acorns. Well, they're actually managed oftentimes with fire. And so fire changed the forest structure. Fire led a more open forest structure. Trees with a wider crown. Trees with wider crowns will produce more acorns. The other thing that fire did was it controlled pests and disease. So insects that were living in the soil surface or at the vegetative layer get burned by the fire. And those same insects would be ones that would attack the acorns and make the acorns not desirable for people. So fire is a really neat tool for managing trees. And this is just some of that pest life cycle in the western United States as it relates to larvae that predate acorns and how fire can interrupt that cycle. Apples. Apples go back a long way. They go back to Eastern Asia, and now they're just a big staple crop of human diets. So this is just the movement of apples through the world at different points in time. And the size of this fruit, the flavor of this fruit, the diversity of what you can use it for has really made it spread across the world as a really staple food for people. We know about Johnny Appleseed. So John Chapman was actually Johnny Appleseed. And Johnny Appleseed planted apple trees all over what was once called the Old Northwest, which was really just Ohio and Western New York before it was settled by Europeans. They called it the Old Northwest. And to own land in the Old Northwest, you had to stake your claim on the land, and part of that condition was you needed to plant a certain number of apple and peach trees. And so Johnny Appleseed, he wasn't just out planting random apple trees everywhere. He was actually taking seeds from apple cider facilities in Pennsylvania, taking burlap bags of those seeds and traveling around the Old Northwest, planting those into orchards. And those seeds would not only give him ownership of that land, it would also serve as a nursery where other settlers could come and buy trees from Johnny Appleseed. So just a really neat legacy there on the landscape. And some of Johnny Appleseed's trees may very well still be out there, which is interesting. One of the neat things we have in this region is maple syrup. I teach a maple syrup course at Yale, all about how you make maple syrup and how climate change is impacting the trees and the process for making maple syrup and how we can adapt to that in the future. What's really neat about maple syrup, so it can come from any maple tree, Primarily, it comes from sugar maple and red maple. And it can be done at all kinds of scales. So you could have one tree with one tap that gives you a few gallons of sap that you boil down into syrup. Or you could have, I used to manage a 6,000 tap maple operation. So 6,000 trees that we were tapping and collecting sap from. And so what happens with maple trees is in the springtime, when you have a freeze-thaw cycle, it creates pressure in the tree. When we drill a hole in that tree, that pressure is released and sap drips out. And you can see in the image at the bottom right, sap dripping out of this tree. That's what it looks like coming out. It's about 2% sugar content. We take that sap and we remove most of the water until it's 66% sugar. And that's what is maple syrup, which is what you see in the top right-hand corner. And so this is real maple syrup. This is sap that came out of the tree with 2% of it being sugar. And we concentrated that sugar down by evaporating water to make a sugar that's entirely from the tree. It is not the log cabin maple syrup, the log cabin pancake syrup you see in the store, which is actually, that's made from high fructose corn syrup. This is true maple syrup from a tree. And this is a long history. So Native Americans were the first ones to make maple syrup, and they actually made maple sugar. So they concentrated it down all the way into granulated sugar. And the reason was Native Americans didn't have glass bottles or tins. And so for them, they were storing maple sugar in birch baskets, birch bark baskets. And it was much easier to store sugar than, think about it, if you were a woodland culture person and you were traveling on a woods trail and you tripped and you dropped your birch basket of maple syrup, it's going to be very hard to get that off the ground. But if you trip and drop your birch basket of maple sugar, you can put that sugar back into the basket. So they made maple sugar, and these are some of the techniques from the Maple Museum up in New York State. And then this is an old image of boiling water off of maple sap to make sugar. And this is a more modern way of doing it. You can see in the top right-hand corner, that's the bottom of a sap tank. So what you see in that clear foamy liquid is actually maple sap. And what you see in the bottom right-hand corner is the finished product on top of a 40-gallon barrel. And then you see the syrup, which is nearly finished in the evaporator pan there. It's a tan color and bubbling. And on the left-hand side, this is a modern wood-fired evaporator where we boil the water off the maple syrup. There's a lot more to this. It can be a lot more industrial, but that's the basic process. And it's just really amazing, these things we get from trees. One of the really interesting things I like to point out about maple syrup in terms of traditional culture is not only is it completely and very important to Native Americans in the northeastern part of the United States and southeastern Canada, but it really goes back a long way in New England, so Connecticut's culture. Maple sugar was actually something that people in the North, in the middle 1800s, when slavery was going on in the United States, people in the North were producing more maple syrup than they had ever produced, and far more than Canada, and more than we were even producing for maple syrup in the late 1990s. So in the middle 1800s, there was a very large demand for maple syrup, and part of that demand was an intentional production of sugar from trees in the North, so that way we could have it compete against sugar cane produced by slavery in the South. So in the middle 1800s, maple syrup received a lot of interest and intention as a way of reducing the economics incentives of slavery. A really neat history, or sort of a bump in the history of maple syrup there, as it relates to a much more important social dynamic.
Hey, Joe,
So,
sorry to jump in.
Yep.
We'll probably do maybe 4 or 5 minutes of talk and then open it up for questions.
Sounds good. I'll wrap it up. So thanks, Matt. What trees can we tap? Maples. There's also other saps, birch, sycamore, walnuts. Those are kind of different. We can talk about those another time. The last sort of roundup here is agroforestry practices. So we think about modern agriculture. Well, modern agriculture often doesn't have many trees in it because trees take a lot of labor and time. But agroforestry is a field that I've specialized in for a long time that is an effort, get more trees integrated into agriculture to store carbon dioxide, to improve soil quality, to have more perennial systems. And so there's a number of practices: alley cropping, windbreaks, silvopasture, forest farming. They're pretty common. There's a lot of benefits to these. I just mentioned them. And this PowerPoint's being recorded and shared, so I know that if folks want to look at these in more depth, they can. Silvopasture is where I focus. I raise cattle. I also have done a lot of research in this. And the idea here is that instead of feeding cows grains or bringing food to animals, we can pasture them. We can provide them shade while they're eating. So think about it. If it were 90 degrees and you were sitting in the middle of the sun, would you want to be eating anything? Probably not. Maybe ice cream, but probably not anything else. But for cattle, if we give them shade, they're going to want to eat. But it's different than just putting animals in the woods. So the thing about silvopasture, it's intentional. We're managing those animals. We're maintaining the soil health. We're actively keeping the trees. It's very different than just putting them out in the woods and letting them do whatever they want. That's actually a very destructive practice. So this is a really intentional way of growing grass for animals to eat while giving them shade. So that's the wrap up there. So if you have any questions, hopefully you're not as grossed out as this cow of mine, but happy to answer any of them.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Joe. I certainly learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions. Like I said, please feel free to unmute yourselves, ask them directly. It looks like we also have one in the chat. So if anyone wants to chime in.
So Chris is asking, how widespread are silvopasture practices? Well, globally, they're very widespread. And especially if you go to tropical regions, South America has a large amount of silvopasture. The Dehesa and Montado systems in Portugal and Spain and parts of the Mediterranean are really important cork oak systems, places where animals under trees on pasture for thousands of years. There's modern challenges to those systems as they relate to policies from the European Union and incentives to have more animals than the land can support. But they go back a long ways, and they're really pretty amazing systems. What's happened in those Dehesa and Montado systems is fire, which was the historical disturbance on the landscape, has been replaced by grazing, but it's been replaced over 1,000 years. And so when we look at what's natural in those areas, what's natural is actually, over the last 1,000 years at least, is grazing livestock. So yeah, but in the northeastern United States, silvopasture isn't very common. What's more common is people just fencing off part of their forest and putting animals into it. And that's very destructive. And one of the easiest ways to tell the difference between that destructive woodland grazing and silvopasture is silvopasture has grass in the understory, and putting animals in the woods has typically mud or dirt or nothing in the understory.
Great.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll mention one of the other place where there's quite a bit of silvopasture in this country is the southeastern United States. So in the southeast, where there's loblolly and longleaf pine, there's a tradition of grazing animals amongst those areas. But yeah, what's destructive about just putting animals in the woods is, well, one, if it's pigs, they root, and so we can look at the pigs over here, and they're just having a good time rooting things up, and that's what they do. But the problem is, if you put them in the forest, they're rooting things. And well, what roots are they rooting? Those are the roots of your trees, and your trees need those roots to survive. And trees have a lot of energy stored in their wood, and so they can live with a lot of damage for a number of years, 5, 6, 10 years. But what happens is they're not good at recovering, at coming right back. And so when we damage things like the roots of a tree, we actually can end a century's worth of tree growth with a week of damage just by killing the roots. But we don't see that death and that mortality for 5, 10 years. So that's one of the problems. And even though pigs are actively doing it by seeking out the roots, other livestock like cattle or goats or sheep or horses, when we put them in the woods without a grass layer, without enough light getting to the understory to allow grass to grow, their hoof action cuts and damages the roots. It also compacts the soil, and that compaction reduces the air holding capacity of the soil, and trees' roots need to breathe. So if we get rid of the airspace, we smother those trees' roots and we don't allow them to breathe. So that's really what we're watching out for, in addition to just physical damage. So, I mean, horses can just peel bark off of trees, and physical damage is part of it too. But really where we want to be careful is the roots of our trees. And that goes for grazing livestock. It goes for working around trees anywhere. If we can keep the roots intact, we can keep a healthy tree.
Great. So it looks like we have another question in our chat from Tanila. How long can you leave a tap in a maple tree?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, you can leave a tap in a maple tree for a long time, but you only want to leave it in a maple tree during the season when you're getting sap. And so we collect sap from maple trees. For example, in the New Haven area, typically is from the end of January or early February until typically the end of March or early April. And so that end of winter, beginning of spring period is when we want to have taps in our trees. And we only really want to have usually one tap per tree, maybe two, because nobody likes this analogy, but I always talk about it like giving blood. I can give blood out of one arm every now and then, but I can't give blood out of all my limbs all the time. And so when you put a whole bunch of taps in a maple tree, you're taking too much from it and you're not allowing it to recover. So when we tap it, we do it in the late winter, early spring. And the reason we do it then is for two reasons. One, the winter time, the tree has stored all those sugars in the tree. And the reason it stored those sugars is so it can use them in the spring to swell up its buds and make new leaves. So we capture a few of those to use for us for maple syrup. We leave the rest of them for the tree to make new leaves. So that's when there's sugar in the wood. The other reason is we tap trees in the spring because there's this freeze-thaw cycle. And that freeze-thaw cycle has, when liquid water, sap in the tree warms above freezing, it expands. But wood doesn't expand, and so it just goes under pressure. And at night, when the area freezes, liquid contracts, and it creates suction. And so more liquid comes up from the roots or comes down from the branches and fills up that area. And then in the day, it expands again. And if we put a hole in it, when the day warms up, it's going to drip sap out. So that's why one of the reasons we do it in the spring. If you were to drill a hole in a maple tree in the summertime when the leaves are out and then run that in a piece of tubing into a bucket of water, the tree's actually going to suck the water out of the bucket. Because when the leaves are out, they're transpiring. So they're evaporating water, which is then pulling water through the water column of the tree. And there's actually a net suction on the tree. So if you drill a hole in it in the summertime and put tubing into it, it's actually going to suck water up. But in the wintertime, there's no leaves, so there's no net suction up the tree. You get this pressure when it warms up.
What, Joe, I have a follow-up question to that. What do you do, say, when you're not actively tapping a maple tree with the hole that you've used to locate the tap? What happens with that in the off season?
Sure. Yeah. So that should heal over. So the idea is you drill a hole, and then and the hole's about the size of your finger. You drill the hole, it goes about 2.5 inches in, and then you put the spout in. You let it do its thing over the course of the season. And about this time of year, April, the season's done, May, sometime before the tree starts to grow for the year, you pull the spout out of the tree, let that heal over. And that's what you want to happen. Now, you don't need to fill it in, because once you drill a hole in wood, you've already caused the damage. So you're not going to be able to fix that damage. The way the tree is going to be able to fix the damage is it's going to grow over that hole. And so that's what we want to do. We want to pull the spout out to allow the tree to close up the hole by growing a new year's wood over it. And then we don't go and drill in that same area of that tap hole until the tree's grown enough wood that it's far enough past it, which usually takes like 30 years. So we have to keep going around the tree.
Got it. So we have another, oh, go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so it does vary by the size of the tree, but let's say we have like a 16-inch diameter tree. It's a mature tree. It's got a big crown. We have one tap in it. That one tap will typically yield about a quarter of a gallon of maple syrup per year. So that's about 10 gallons of sap is what that tree will yield, and that will get boiled down to about a quart of maple syrup. Now, that does depend on the sugar content of the tree and a whole number of other things. If we put a vacuum pump, like we suck some of the sap out of that tree, we can actually get 20 gallons of sap per tree, which is about a half a gallon of syrup. So we can double our yield with some of the more technological practices. But I see another question about, it says, what is the most exciting farming practice, in my opinion, that's happening in the region? Well, my opinion, it's growing figs, but you know, that's my opinion. No, I think one of the exciting things about what's happening in the region is the push for smaller scale farms and people trying to actually improve their soil. So that's something that we haven't done long enough, is really saying, how can we not only use our soil to grow food, but how can we improve it by storing carbon in it, making it more fertile, growing perennial crops. I think that's one of the really exciting things that's happening in the region. In the livestock realm, I think that relates to grazing. So growing grass and legumes to feed livestock, in the sense of they're out there consuming it themselves. I think there's an animal welfare component to that. And I think that's really exciting. And there's people who are doing that in really amazing ways. And then in the vegetable sort of annual crop realm, I think looking at cover crops and ways we can intercrop and all of that soil building aspects of it is really exciting.
Great. I have another question. You know, for those of us here in New Haven, where space may be at a premium, what are some agroforestry techniques that can be applied maybe at a smaller scale in either your yard or a neighborhood community garden, that would work kind of within the fabric of the city, not needing a whole lot of space?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to cover that. I had one private question sent to me just to show some of the slides I skipped over fast, just so people can go through them. So as I answer your question, Matt, I'm just going to go up to a couple of slides every 2 seconds, just so people can have them on the recording if they're interested. Yeah, there's all kinds of things you can do. I mean, one of the biggest things I think folks can do is just to get into it, just to get started, is grow a garden. There's community garden plots. Maybe you have a lawn at your house. Maybe you can do a raised bed. Maybe there's a little flower garden that you could, you know, plant some basil or some peas in. But that's one, or lettuce. I mean, kale is super easy to grow. All kinds of greens, depending on, you know, whatever you like to eat, you can usually grow it. If it's mangoes, you're gonna have trouble, but any vegetables you can probably grow. So that's one thing I think people should really do is grow a garden. In the livestock realm, it's harder because there's rules and regulations in the city. So that way your lives, you know, if I had a bunch of pigs in my backyard, that may affect my neighbor. I mean, we have 130 acres here, so the neighbors don't even know we have pigs, you know, but it's in a city, you have to be more cognizant of your neighbors. You want to keep friendly with everybody. And so it's harder with animals. I mean, some chickens, there's rules and regs, I know, in New Haven about that. But if you have enough land, some chickens are a really good way to get started with livestock. You can have eggs. And you can raise chickens that aren't roosters to produce eggs. But yeah, I do think, you know, fruit trees are really worthwhile. Pears grow well in New Haven. Apples grow well in New Haven. You can get dwarf apple trees. And so these are trees that have been grafted under rootstock that restricts their growth. So they only ever get to be I mean, you get a really dwarf apple tree, it's only going to ever be 6 or 7 feet tall. And you'll have to put a stake or a post to hold it up. But you can get a lot of apples from those trees. And that'd be one way to do it. You know, one of the neat things I've seen in urban settings is espalier, which is something I'm really excited about. I've been over the last year, you get these things where you're like, wow, I want to do some of that. But that's a practice where you actually grow the fruit tree and you train it to grow horizontally or grow in a certain way against the side of a building. And so that's sort of a neat practice you can do where you can have a lot of fruit produced in a small amount of space. But yeah, fruit trees just they make a lot of sense to me in an urban setting. Now it's harder if it's a street tree and these other things, because those fruit, if you don't use them, are going to bring in raccoons and they're going to bring in birds and they're going to bring in a mess on the street. So you do want to be thoughtful about where you put a fruit tree in an urban setting as well, and cleaning up the fruit if you can't use it all. But you can press fruit into juices. There's so much you can do with that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we get concerns from people about berries on sidewalks all the time.
Yeah. I mean, mulberries are kind of the classic like urban tree that produces a ton of fruit. It's delicious, but they just make a mess. You walk in them and they go into all the buildings. So you want to be, with any farming you do, you want to be as intentional as you can be. I mean, that's what to me always separates agriculture farming from just exploitation of resources or hunter gathering. Is farming is intentional. We are managing it. We are deciding what's being done. It doesn't mean that we're not working with nature, we're not learning from nature on how to do it, but we're making intentional decisions about it and we're managing it as it goes through.
Excellent. So it looks like we maybe have a couple minutes, so maybe time for one last question.
Oh, I didn't have a question. This is Caro, but I do have a quick comment. One sort of sneaky fruit tree that gets into our street tree inventory is the serviceberry, also known as the shadblow or the amelanchier. And I collect serviceberries in New Haven every June and make really delicious jam. And they're all over downtown along Yale's campus too. So I encourage folks to check out our street tree inventory and to find some serviceberries this spring. Also, thanks, Joe. This presentation has been awesome.
Oh, thanks, Kara. Yeah, thanks for noting serviceberry or Saskatoon.
Saskatoon berry, yeah.
Really good.
Right, many names.
Yeah. A neat fact about serviceberry, one of the reasons it's called serviceberry is it's one of the first trees to flower. And in the north, when serviceberry would flower, that's when people knew the ground was thawed enough to go bury their dead that they couldn't bury over the winter. So it's kind of a neat thing. Chris is asking blueberries and strawberries. Yeah, absolutely. Blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, black raspberries. You can grow all of those really easily in your yard. Blueberries, you're going to have to watch the birds, but high bush blueberry will do well. So yeah, there's a lot you can grow. There's also resources out there. So University of Connecticut Extension is somewhere I'd go if you're wondering about, growing gardening. And I bet URI has some resources they can share as well. At Yale, we have the Yale Landscape Lab, which sometimes will have events about urban gardening. And we also have the Yale Farm through the Yale Food Sustainability Project. So there's quite a bit of resources out there I think we could connect people with on farming.
Excellent. Well, thanks. I'll echo what everyone else said. Thanks so much, Joe. Really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. This was fantastic. I'm hungry for some fruit now. Thank you to all the students and our teachers for joining and sending in your questions. As always, we appreciate your input and taking your time on your Thursday mornings to join us for these chats. This is all recorded, so we'll share the recordings and you can look through these slides at your own leisure. And otherwise, thank you all, and we'll see you next week. We have another chat lined up for next Thursday. And Colleen, the subject is escaping me.
Yeah, next week will be Mike Ferrucci will be talking about the all-important how is toilet paper made from trees, and Chris Ozick will co-host with Mike Ferrucci. So thank you so much, Joe. And yeah, looking forward to seeing everybody again next Thursday.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.